Shortly after intellectuals announced the end of history and peace under a new international order, one of the bloodiest conflicts we've seen in recent decades broke out in Iraq. The 2003 invasion by an international coalition led by the United States and the public execution of leader Saddam Hussein led to a spiral of violence, which has left an as yet unclear number of more than 1 million human beings dead, as well as conflicts that are still present in the region to this day. The United States claimed that it carried out this invasion because of the alleged ties between Saddam Hussein's government and the Al-Qaeda organization, and because of the alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction by Iraq. It's also very common to hear that the invasion was actually carried out because of Iraqi oil. However, there may be more unknown elements in this story of bloody war and public execution than. What are the well-known and not-so-well-known explanations for this event that marked the history of the 21st century? The Iraq War is a very broad topic, so here we can only superficially approach the main hypotheses that specialists and scholars in the field have put forward about the causes of this war and the condemnation of Saddam Hussein. The first thing that must be said is that all the documents from the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, intelligence agencies, Senate investigative committees, and the United States Department of State showed that there was no evidence that Saddam Hussein cooperated with organizations like Al-Qaeda, nor that Saddam Hussein had the so-called weapons of mass destruction. Several of these documents were published by the United States Senate itself, even just a year after the war had started. The inspections carried out by the United States on Iraqi territory during the war confirmed that there were no such weapons. Both President Bush and the Prime Minister of England, Tony Blair, were aware of all this, as well as the intelligence information that showed that Iraq, a country that at that time was economically devastated, was far from representing a military threat to the United States. So, is it a public fact that the whole story presented to the world to justify the war was a fabricated narrative without evidence? Rather, the instability that the United States invasion brought to the Middle East and the support they gave to any group that opposed Saddam Hussein resulted in a proliferation of more and larger armed Islamist groups. On the other hand, it can't be said that the invasion was to promote democracy and human rights against a tyrant either. When the United States was a key ally of Saddam Hussein during his decades of greatest repression, when the United States is still a key ally of autocracies like Saudi Arabia, and when Saddam Hussein was not tried in the International Criminal Court after being captured, but within his own country in a court dominated by the United States. So according to studies, invasion, reasons plus this war, it's essential to put into context, as we said, that Saddam Hussein was an ally of the United States for a long time. After Iraq experienced 10 years of stability, development, and repression of dissent during the government of Saddam Hussein's party, in 1980 Hussein decided, with the support of the United States, to embark on an invasion against Iran, claiming old territorial disputes. The United States not only supported the bloody war started by Saddam Hussein, but also secretly sold weapons to Iran. In the famous Iran-Contra scandal under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, another key point is that there had been significant hostility between Iraq and Israel for quite some time. Israel considered Iraq to be a government that was not under its control or friendship, and therefore a regional threat. Iraq believed Israel was conspiring against it. At the beginning of this war between Iraq and Iran in 1981, Israel carried out a bombing that destroyed the most important nuclear reactor under construction in Iraq, where a pioneering nuclear energy program in the region was being developed. Soon after the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, which ended without a clear winner, and more than 1 million human beings dead on both sides, a Saddam Hussein who felt betrayed by the United States decided to invade Kuwait in 1990 to regain the influence he had lost, claiming that Kuwait was waging a harsh trade war against his country. All the documentation shows that the United States gave Hussein the green light to carry out this invasion. However, shortly after starting the war, the United States, under the government of George Bush Sr., led an international coalition that attacked Iraq and swiftly defeated Hussein's forces. It is well documented that to gain public support for this war, the United States fabricated stories such as the famous testimony of Nayirah before the United States Congress, a teenage girl who claimed to have seen Iraqi soldiers taking newborns out of their incubators in Kuwait. But it was later discovered that Nayirah was the daughter of the United States ambassador in Kuwait, and that her testimony had been false. Since this war with Kuwait, called the First Gulf War, relations between the West and Iraq were broken. Iraq became the only nation in the Persian Gulf with a considerable army and huge oil reserves that was not currently under United States influence. Trade sanctions were imposed against the Arab nation. The United States carried out various sporadic bombings during the 1990s, and hostilities between Israel and Iraq increased. And in the United States, it began to be openly discussed that removing Saddam Hussein from power should be a goal of United States foreign policy in the Middle East. All of this happened long before the fall of the towers on September 11, So since there were no weapons of mass destruction and the Iraqi government had no ties to Islamist organizations like Al-Qaeda, what other real reasons have been given for this invasion? One of the most common alternative explanations is that this was a war to control Iraq's oil. But according to scholars on the subject, although the United States has always had a great interest in controlling this oil enclave in the Persian Gulf, and although oil was a key factor in gaining the support of major companies for the war, oil alone could not have explained the decision to invade this region. There is no solid evidence that American oil companies lobbied for this war to take place. Many of these companies were actually opposed to the war, since they preferred stability in the Middle East for their business rather than a conflict of this kind. Likewise, Saddam Hussein, on his part, even offered privileges to American companies in order to de-escalate the tension that existed between the two countries. In fact, several post-war oil contracts in Iraq went to Chinese and Russian companies. So it seems there are other, less discussed aspects that triggered this war, according to scholars on the subject. Let's look at one of these less discussed aspects. United States senators and scholars of international relations have argued that oil alone was a secondary factor in the war. Meanwhile, according to them, what there is enough evidence for is that the lobby of the State of Israel in the United States and the so-called neoconservative groups, almost all with dual Israeli citizenship, were the biggest active and public promoters of this invasion of the Middle East. Senators and scholars argue that while others were interested in the war, it would not have occurred without these Israeli groups, that this allegedly would not have been a war for the interests of the United States, but for the interests of Israel. All of this, according to these authors, as part of a long-term strategy to install governments in the Middle East that are favorable to Israel's interests, as well as to defend the Petrodollar system, which guarantees the primacy of the Federal Reserve. The neoconservative movement is a political current in the United States that began in the 1960s, made up mainly of Hebrews. It gradually gained more and more presence in the government, banking, and media in the United States, reaching its peak during the administration of George Bush. Neoconservatives are openly pro-war, promoters of American expansionism, advocates for increasing the country's defense spending, and publicly committed to the expansionism of Israel. The members of this movement have created numerous highly influential think tanks in North America, such as the Institute for National Security Affairs and the Project for the New American Century, where figures like Dick Cheney, John Bolton, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Elliott Abrams, and others have worked, who, before, during, or after serving in these think tanks, have also held high positions in the United States government, both under George Bush Jr. and George Bush Sr., both of whom have a history of having attacked Iraq during their presidencies. Regarding the Israel lobby, which is closely linked to the neoconservatives, one of its main manifestations is the well-known American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that is, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Israel, a lobbying group with a strong presence in Congress and the White House, with the open goal of promoting Israel's interests in the United States, a group in which all major American politicians of recent decades have participated energetically and proudly. Benjamin Netanyahu's interview statements have appeared since the 1980s. Even back then, he was already talking about the high level of influence that Israel had in the White House and in the United States Congress. Less than a year after the war began, in 2004, Senator Ernst Hollings made a statement in the United States Congress that the United States had invaded Iraq to protect Israel from its regional enemy, which was Iraq, and that everyone in Washington knew it, that everyone knew Iraq was not a threat to the United States, and that this war had nothing to do with the interests of Americans. George Bush Jr. twice noted the need to overthrow Hussein due to the threat he posed to Israel. No other group in the United States showed the level of support for the war in Iraq like the Neoconservatives, who were very close to Israel's political parties. Since 1996, an important document written by a prominent Israeli think tank in the United States, delivered to then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, emphasized the need to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Quote, "What was a strategic objective of Israel in its own right," end quote. It was by Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wormser, three American Israelis who would later hold high government and military positions in the George Bush administration. Son? In 1998, these same figures sent a letter to Bill Clinton urging him to start the war against Iraq. Both documents advocated for Israel to maintain its policy of territorial expansion. Israeli newspapers like Haaretz also feature these headlines. Since 2002, a year before the war, they were announcing that the Israeli army and Israel's political leaders were calling for a war in Iraq, and that Israel would pressure President Bush to go to war against Saddam Hussein. The 2003 Iraq War launched by Bush Jr. is well documented. Like every group of the Israeli lobby, it spoke out strongly in defense of the American president and the need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. For example, the executive director of American Israel Public Affairs Committee named Ayak Hawar Khor told the press in January 2003 that one of American Israel Public Affairs Committee's recent great successes was having lobbied quietly and silently so that Congress would finally approve the use of force in Iraq. An award-winning Israeli journalist and three-time member of the Israeli parliament named Uri Avneri wrote the following a few weeks after the invasion. I quote, "They hold key positions both in the Bush administration and in advisory bodies and prominent newspapers. The United States controls the world and Israel controls the United States," end quote. This chapter is closed. Did other factors influence the decision to wage this war, according to some scholars? One was the ongoing business of war, controlled by the so-called military-industrial complex, a group of corporations that live off armed conflicts and that also have great influence in American politics. The other influential factor was the safeguarding of the already mentioned petrodollar system. Since the Bretton Woods agreements, after World War II, the dollar has been established as the world's reference currency. And since the mid-70s, through a series of agreements and diplomatic maneuvers, especially with Saudi Arabia, oil-exporting countries in Africa, Asia, and America have been de facto forced to sell oil only in exchange for dollars. Then the surplus of these petrodollars in the oil-producing countries had to be placed back into the financial system and the American banking sector. The Bretton Woods system and the petrodollar system have been the main foundation of the commercial and economic supremacy of the United States in the world. Considering this, the year 2000 was near and the euro was becoming a global currency. And Saddam Hussein, besieged by United States sanctions, announced that his country would leave the petrodollar system. In the year 2000, Iraq began to sell its oil globally in exchange for euros and not dollars, according to different specialists. That Iraq and other countries would eventually start using the euro or other currencies to trade oil would mean, in the medium term, a loss of more than 30% of the dollar's value. A couple of years after starting to sell oil in euros, the United States invades Iraq and Saddam is publicly eliminated. Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, on his part, tries to create the golden dinar, a new African currency that would support trade between these African nations and would replace the dollar. Shortly after, also due to United States intervention, he ends up being overthrown. So with these actions, the United States would allegedly be guaranteeing its geopolitical objectives, reaffirming the supremacy of the dollar in energy trade, sending a message to other oil-producing countries that might want to do the same, putting one of the largest oil reserves under the direct control of the United States, creating a key point of influence towards the other Arab countries neighboring Iraq, both oil-producing and non-oil-producing, and in addition, neutralizing a regional threat to Israel's geopolitical objectives. Ultimately, in the back corridors of politics, there is always much that the public will never know, and for which speculation and hypotheses are the only options. Kenneth Roth, director of Human Rights Watch, said that the reason Saddam Hussein was tried under an Iraqi government controlled by the United States rather than in the International Criminal Court was so that the United States could protect its own dirty laundry, focusing on Hussein's crimes instead of the complicity of the United States. It's a topic that will remain full of mysteries, and all we can do is present some hypotheses to help better understand the world around us. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. You can get the new encyclopedia below in both English and Portuguese. Like all the videos on their channels, share them with your friends, check out the content that's really worth it, and well, subscribe to both platforms. Thank you all, and God bless you.